I have Chris here joining me today. Chris, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why don't we start with you giving us a short bio? You've got a blank canvas. Throw some paint on there for us to get a better picture of you.
I'm an over-the-road truck driver turned electrician. To start with, I went to school in Western Washington. I was probably primed for a certain intellectual direction. I was sent to a philosophy camp at the University of Washington in the summer after 5th grade. So probably biased me in a particular direction there. And never...
Are your parents both intellects then?
I wouldn't say so. They're not intellectuals, they're smart. Sure,
I'm just wondering who's pushing their kids to philosophy camp.
I think I had expressed some interest in that direction, and they were pacing me. So they're like, oh, this is something he would like.
Cool.
But yeah, and then I discovered, I was very, very fortunate. I had friends that were smarter than me in middle school and high school. They're like competitive mathematicians and chess players, and they're like programming video games in Java and all this stuff back in the like late 90s, early 2000s. So, I got to hang out and have conversations with them, which was almost certainly priming as well. And then I discovered Christopher Hitchens in high school, actually. And that was, I guess it was all downhill from there.
I'm with you there.
Yeah. I was doing an essay on the ethics of torture for a class senior year. And here was this journalist who had been a strong supporter of waterboarding. And then out of intellectual curiosity decided, well, if I'm going to be writing about this, I ought to know what I'm talking about. And he had himself waterboarded. And afterwards, he changed his mind publicly on the matter. And I was so impressed by that. Like publicly changing your mind on something was something I'd seen so rarely that it really stuck out to me.
Right? Like
thereabouts.
Where is it? Why can't we have more of that?
Yeah, thereabouts 8. I think he was probably writing about this around 2005, 2006, somewhere thereabouts. It was after the invasion of Iraq.
Right.
And it was, it's something I've continued to admire in people who publicly change their minds about things. Obviously, you don't want to be like flip-flopping and just, where's the wind going?
Of course.
But taking it in like a political fashion, but taking arguments seriously and being able to see the better argument. I very much not a Christian, but I've always admired the story of Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, including truck drivers, who initially he wanted to follow the strongest master. So initially he followed the king, but then the king expressed fear of the devil. So he said, okay, I will serve the devil then. But then the devil expressed fear of God. And so he said, oh, I'll follow God then. And that was where his story ends because it's a Christian story. But that spirit of being willing to drop one thing and pick up the better thing is, I always thought was right.
Okay. So move on from there. You ended up going to school, right?
Yes. I
studied philosophy for a bit.
I spent a couple years in the military. But then I was going to school for philosophy.
What branch of the military?
Navy Reserves and Marine Corps.
Okay.
Yeah. Then at school, I was studying journalism and philosophy. And after, a couple of years of that, I learned that journalism is basically evil. And this is back in 2013 or so. And philosophy, one, there's no money in it. But two...
Can I pause you? Was it Hitch that inspired you to study journalism?
Yes, actually. Yes, directly. And specifically his reasoning for it, which was he didn't trust the media. So he wanted to go out and get this information for himself. So he became a journalist to do it. And he was also not a small part of the inspiration for philosophy too. I'd been exposed to other philosophers as well. I was reading like Marcus Aurelius and Cicero in particular in high school. But yeah, he was the inspiration for interest in journalism in particular. And, so the journalism was awful, that whole world. And philosophy, that not only was there no money in it, but it was also, you don't need to go to college to do it at all. Right. And in fact, it's almost better if you do it outside of college, which can be kind of counterintuitive, because college is where you have access to all the professors, where you have access to all these libraries and all these, databases and so forth. But it's also constraining in a lot of ways. The social pressure to conform to particular views, and some of this was based on ideology, some of it was based on financial interest. The way that grants work in college is not even something most people outside of academia think about, are so constraining that the best avenue for intellectual freedom seemed to me to be to take a job that had nothing to do with intellectual exploration at all, like truck driving or something. You could be an actual communist or a Nazi or a crazy person. I hope I'm not repeating myself there. A schizophrenic or something. As long as you get your loads to their destinations on time and don't cause accidents and stuff, they don't care. You can explore any line of thinking at all, and you won't be, canceled or unpublished or anything for it. Now, of course, the cost is no one's going to care what you have to say, generally speaking. But maybe that'll dovetail us to the Republic towards later on. I got accepted to Western Washington University. Didn't go, and I became an over-the-road truck driver instead.
Cool. And just have been exploring philosophy on your own since.
Yeah, I actually wrote my first book mostly from the road. It ended up being published in 2017. I stopped truck driving in 2016 because that was the year I got married. But I wrote most of it over the road, and that was In Defense of Hatred. You may have heard arguments that love and hatred are mutually exclusive, and you should love and you should not hate, as though they are exclusive. And those struck me as not just as a silly dichotomy, but in fact, actually kind of a harmful one. So that was my first book, which I wrote over the road, and remains somewhat unfortunately my most popular book, because once I finished that book, I have not really devoted much thought to hatred since then. It was just like, there's this one point that needed to be explained. It's like, all right, moving on to the other things. But right. I guess the catchy title sticks out to people. And so, and that you write an interesting book, and then you network with other people, and you get kind of interested in other topics. And I've been, I've had a lifelong kind of in and out relationship with Christianity. I was a very, very strong Christian in high school. And that led to me becoming
any particular form?
No, actually, I wouldn't say so. I mean, I guess American Protestantism is a form of its own, but I wasn't I wasn't defined by being Episcopalian or Baptist or anything like that. Sure. It was sort of a non-denominational Methodist thing. At the time, I couldn't have told you what differentiates a Methodist from a Baptist. Sure. I barely understood what being a Unitarian meant, as opposed to a Trinitarian. But then, perhaps concomitant with discovering actually predating Christopher Hitchens by a little bit, I lost faith in high school and ultimately, not immediately, but ultimately became a very, very strong atheist. I actually ran a chapter of the Secular Student Alliance in Bellevue for the college I attended there for a couple of years. And it was fun. It was cool. But after a while, it's like, there's actually nothing here exactly. It's not really.
So do you still identify as an atheist?
No, I would not call myself an atheist. I would call myself a pagan. And I would call myself a classical pagan as opposed to a new age pagan.
Yeah, that atheist is kind of an empty term, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it might be a non-existent category too, depending on how you define things. It all comes down to definitions, right? But especially when you talk to Christians, for example, they'll talk about idolatry. It's like, oh, you make a god out of X, or you make a god out of Y, you make a god out of money, out of nation, out of family. These are all forms of idolatry, essentially. But idol worship is a form of religiosity. And now they believe that these things are false gods, or not as real or as true as the one true God or whatever. But the behavior of religiosity is still there. And I think everybody is actually religious. It's just a matter of what are you worshiping? Right? What's the ideal? The scientists, and I don't mean the like scientific journalists who are just badly summarizing scientific papers in an effort to push some kind of political thing. I mean the people doing the research and the people who really believe in what they're doing and trying to do it well. They are in a Socratic hero cult. I don't mean cult in a denigrating way. I mean it in a descriptive anthropological way. They are participants in a Socrates hero cult where they believe that knowledge is salvific and is freeing to the human animal and species. If you read, what was the book called? Carl Sagan. The subtitle is Science as a Candle in the Dark.
Yeah.
I don't remember the main title.
Yeah.
That's religious language. That's speaking of science and the possibility of knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge as something that will that has salvific power, can save us from fear, especially, and to maybe a lesser degree from conflict.
Sure, I would use the word spiritual here, but it's whatever.
It is spiritual.
Swapping terms.
Yeah. Well, so I think of
when I think of religious, and I guess in each of these instances, there may be an element of this, but when I think of religious, I think more dogmatic structure.
Fair. That's fair. There's many different ways to use each term. The way I think of spiritual is as connected with a particular spirit. In this case, Socrates, perhaps in the Christian's case with Jesus. And religion is a kind of scaffolding. Religion is like, if your goal is to be fit, then your personal fitness trainer is your like religion. He's trying to guide you with an ordered program, but the goal is not the structure. The goal is the endpoint, which is fitness. The goal is the given.
I like that frame.
The goal is the development of the spiritual connection that's attached to the religion. The religion is just the institution that has developed in order to facilitate that connection. In most cases.
Yeah, I like that frame. Right.
So, institutional science might have parted ways from this. There's a wonderful quote from a 17th century philosopher, and I don't remember his name offhand. But he said, speaking as if to God, he said, "Father, if you had the truth itself in your right hand and the pursuit of the truth, but not the truth itself in the left, I would with all humility take the left, for yours is the truth alone. And in the left hand, in the pursuit of truth, lie the virtues of curiosity, openness, diligence, discipline, and striving. Whereas in the right hand, in the belief of the possession of truth, is arrogance and laziness and conceit and contempt." I'm sure I'm getting the adjectives a little bit haywire there. I don't remember it verbatim, but that was the gist of the quote. Someone can look it up and verify the precise wording and the author of the quote, which is not me. But I think that's the true spirit of science. And whenever people say, oh, like science got this wrong, no actual scientist is bothered by that. They're like, of course we get things wrong. It's not about that. It's about,
it's what we hope for.
Moving towards and falsifying things and so forth. But it sort of betrays how wrong-headed the people who say things like trust the science are in their understanding of the theory and the spirituality behind science. They are spiritually disconnected from what science is at a deeper level.
Agreed.
So I believe that everybody is religious. It's just how conscientiously have you chosen your gods, or your desired spirits? Because in actual religious customs around the world, not everyone worships gods. Some people worship, forces of nature or heroes. Hero cults are a common religious phenomenon. One that I think is actually captured here in Western culture by Santa Claus. Santa Claus is a cult hero. He has all of the hallmarks of classic cult hero worship, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's a good thing. There are certainly bad hero cults. Don't get me wrong. We're not just blanket advocating cults. Don't go follow Charles Manson. That's not a good one. The best hero cult, the hero's already dead. Usually.
Yeah, this is an interesting pivot point, possibly, because here in Utah, there is a cult figure that, over 80% of the population worships, and that's Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS Church. And anyway, when I reached out to you, I thought you could perhaps give my audience, many of whom are currently or who have recently left their faith behind, they are now finding themselves just on top of rubble, not knowing how to move forward. So, I don't know, any kind of, you've already started speaking to these kind of frameworks we can use, but if you have any guidance, please.
Yeah, that's rough. Sure. I mean, disillusionment is no joke. And that's what we're talking about, is the experience of disillusionment. There's, this famous Nietzschean passage in the parable of the madman where he describes the state of the death of God, and it's complete disorientation. There is no up or down. Everything is colder and distant, and we're hurtling through the void. And what do we do in this case? And, and you normally in such a situation, you say, well, you just take a step back and get some perspective. But in this particular case, oftentimes that's not helpful because, you step back and you see all these other religions, and when you stack them all next to each other, they all look equally wrong. And you're like, it's all, and you can get not just disillusioned of one belief system, but disillusioned in belief systems, full stop. You can go,
well, your trust has been taken. You're in a very distrustful place.
Right. And that was exactly how I felt when I first deconverted from Christianity. It was like, how could all of these people have misled me so casually, so thoughtlessly on something that's supposed to be the most important thing that they take so unseriously? And how did I fall for that? The thing that the Mormons have going is at least they seem to take it seriously. I'm sort of speaking as an outsider on it a little bit. But the people who I've talked to who've come out of that, it's really hard, especially for women, and the purity culture there is intense. Not that it doesn't, arguably damage men too. I have to say this with an asterisk, because
just to highlight that point. And recently, our kids, one of their cousins was getting baptized, and we were invited to go to the service. And anyway, we show up, and up on the pulpit, there's just men, the leadership. And then their cousin, she goes up to receive her blessing. Again, it's all men. Every woman in any kind of position has to ultimately report to a man. You have 12-year-old girls confessing their masturbation sins, their thought crimes, everything to a male bishop. So, yeah, just to highlight that women are coming out of this feeling a lot of shame, a lot of distrust.
Yeah.
A lot.
That's not good. And there's like, I'm all for spaces that are just for men. I think that's great and healthy and underrated. Sure. And spaces that are just for women, you know?
Sure.
And there's a place for women mentoring other women. And, you know, where there's a distrust to that, I have like personal empathy problems with that, because who would want a woman who's just subservient in that way? I mean, like, it's kind of a male fantasy on the one hand, but as soon as if you actually have to live with this person, surely, and maybe I'm projecting here, but surely you'd want to be around someone who's interesting and who's fun and challenging, and you learn stuff from, so you get bored. And I'm sure that's why my wife married me. But yeah, I feel like you see this in the Muslim world too. But maybe we're getting sidetracked.
A lot of overlap with Mormons and Muslims. Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe we're getting sidetracked with the disillusionment experience.
Sure. Sorry. I cut you off. Please.
No. You didn't cut me off at all. The problem with stepping back, you know, whether you're evaluating Islam or other things, is that oftentimes it leaves you no less disillusioned, if not even more so. And it can take you into a kind of postmodern place where all ideologies and all belief systems look like propaganda, basically.
Yep.
But my feeling, if we go back to the cult counterexample, there's something very interesting about hero cults like Santa Claus. And forgive me for garden pathing here a little bit. I don't know if there's a simpler way to explain this. It's that there's a single faulty foundation that one of my favorite writers articulated in the distinction between monotheistic religions of belief and what I'm going to very loosely and broadly call pagan religions of practice. There is a Christian idea, monotheistic in general, because you actually see it in religious ideas that predate Christianity and some of the Greeks, that the grounding of the legitimacy of a religion is truth. This thing is true, and therefore we should believe in it, and belief is the foundation for legitimacy, for this religion being like a real religion and one worth following. But there's a different mode of religion that is wasn't just common in the past, but is actually still common now in many places. And that is religions of practice and of participation. And the way my great inspiration, who I referenced a little bit before coming on the show, Greg Naj, is a Harvard philologist and classicist. I had the pleasure and honor of interviewing him a couple of years back, and he described the difference between stories we believe in on the one hand and stories we live by on the other. And with a story you live by, the truth of it is, like the historical truth of it is almost not relevant. If you hear the story of the boy who cried wolf, and you know you're telling the story to your kid, and they say, "Did that story actually happen?" This actually happened with me with my daughter last week. Just did that actually happen? It's like, well, I mean, it probably did at some point, but I don't know if it happened or not, literally. But there are lots of other very similar kinds of things that have happened. And it's a pattern you might notice by sort of comparison. And the example I brought up before of Santa Claus. The Santa cult is a very interesting one because almost no one who participates in it believes in it historically. Almost nobody who participates in the Santa myth, who leaves out cookies and milk and puts up the stockings and prepares the fireplace and maybe even leaves little hoof prints on the ground in the snow. And, maybe you put on the Santa outfit at the mall and participate in this strange Santa ritual reenactment. Almost no one believes that this is real. So why do we do this? Why do we do this thing? Why do we string up lights and stuff if we don't believe it's true? Well, we do it because it's fun and it's cheerful and we're all doing it together and it's a good story. It is a good story, and the goodness of the story isn't contingent on it being true. In fact, if you even ask the question, is it true? You're almost doing the Bruce Lee thing of missing the moon for the finger here. Truth is not the foundation for the legitimacy of this way of living, of this way of interacting with each other, of this framework for being around our friends and family. It's a like, what story am I going to share with my friends and participate with? And obviously you want something that, I'm going to sound like Jordan Peterson here, but like that like resonates with true patterns in the world. And so it's like, oh, is this truth working its way back into the conversation? Well, like maybe kind of in a sense, but if you begin with the idea that we can't actually know what's true with certainty, which is the problem, right? And it's going to be a problem for Christianity. It's going to be a problem for Islam, whether they want to admit it or not. It's going to be a problem for any religion that grounds its faith in truth. So we're actually really bad at figuring out what's true. There's just too many other people trying to lie, right? And we have our own biases that draw us in particular directions over what's like objectively true. And there's a question as to, why did we begin to care about the objective truth in the first place? And I think an interesting, this will sound like complete crazy talk, I think, to many people. But I think a good way of highlighting the difference here in focus is in the domain of material sciences. There's a difference between a scientist on the one hand and an engineer on the other. The scientist is trying to pursue truth, and they will occasionally build things in pursuit of the truth. An engineer has the inverse focus. They are trying to find what works and will occasionally stumble upon rules that we call true in pursuit of what works. But their metric and their goal is a lot more pragmatic and it's less idealistic. They're operating within parameters, plus or minus 5% accuracy in terms of measuring outcomes. If an engineer says, an I-beam of a given thickness has 3,000 pounds of tensile strength to it, that's a generalization. They didn't test that particular I-beam. They probably tested 100 other I-beams of similar proportions, but there's imperfections in the metal, there's variation and so forth. They came up with an average that's good enough, and then they've applied that as a general rule of application in the world. And it works, and we build skyscrapers and we build buildings, and that good enough approach is the knowledge that is deployed in that good enough approach is something that you learn by participation. You learn through apprenticeship and you learn through doing over time. And what I've discovered in my own life is that participation actually gets you a lot closer to a functioning relationship with the world and maybe a relationship with the truth, although the word becomes superfluous after a while, than a more youthful and idealistic approach of, I'm going to figure out what's capital T true. And when you apply this difference in approach and this difference of focus to religion, I think you can actually shift from a monotheistic tradition that focuses upon truth to something more like a classical pagan appreciation for the powers of the world and appreciation for participation in a shared story, and wind up with meaningful connections and a really good life. I hope I didn't lose everybody in that meandering explanation. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, and let me see if I can tighten it up and maybe just reflect it back at you. I agree with a lot of that. And you can even see, I don't know, in places like England right now, there's a shift back to a cultural Christianity, but they don't believe in the literal virgin birth. They don't believe in, some of these historical facts, but they are participating in some of these traditions, like the Santa Claus cult.
Right.
And it creates community support, a lot of valuable things that religions have offered for a long time. Something I did want to clarify, because I think often when we start getting down to our epistemological bedrock, there's this partition. You have people like Jordan Peterson on one side who think that the stories and myths are true in an instrumentalist kind of way. That is this serving you in your life.
Right.
But I don't think there needs to be such a strong partition. Like, yeah, no, absolutely. We can look at stories and say that there is some truth to the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? And we don't need to point to some objective point in the past and it's like, this is the thing. But that can coexist with this other pursuit of trying to objectively understand the world, the human body, its processes, and so on.
Absolutely. And I mean, a story that you are inspired by can also be true. What I'm saying is that if you ground your faith in the value of the story in its historical truth, and then you find out some information that changes the story, is your worldview shattered?
I see.
And that's a problem that happens to all kinds of people in all kinds of domains, not just religion. I mean, imagine if your moral political worldview comes down to Nazis are bad and the Allies are good. Then you run across stories about, American concentration camps, the Japanese, and maybe you learn about Dresden, and like weird things that don't fit into anybody's moralistic narrative. I think building a foundation of your worldview on historical truth, stories based upon their historical truth, closes you off to learning to some degree and makes learning new information something traumatic rather than something that's fun and interesting. And I think it's a process I've gone through a few times, but there are, if you lean into, on the other hand, stories that are beautiful in how they strike us in the telling. They can be inspiring to us, and we can change our mind on those too. Things that were inspiring and noble to me when I was in my 20s, oftentimes now seem a little bit naive. And things that maybe flew under the radar in my 20s are now very, very inspiring to me. And at the top of that list, for me personally, is the story of Odysseus from Homer. Much that is good in Christianity can be found in the Iliad. The focus upon the heroic, the self-sacrifice, the suffering on behalf of others. All of these themes are there, but they are understood within a context and within a set of constraints. We don't know what heroic immortalization is actually like in advance, and maybe it's not something to strive after. Maybe heroes are people we ought to appreciate and to venerate, but not necessarily strive to emulate. And that this sort of other side of the coin that we see in the Odyssey is something that is absent, I think, in Christianity. It steps, 2/3 of the way to Christianity in the Iliad, and then takes a third of a step back and brings a greater sense of balance and an alternative archetypal model of what being a man ought to look like. Andra, the man, singing of the man, uses the first word of the Odyssey. And it's about that, as opposed to the heroes who, died before their time or were thrown before their time into hell in the Iliad. Sorry if I'm sounding so particular about Homer. It's sort of a religious foundation for me. I believe it's the best literature in the Western canon. Not that there aren't other great stuff, but
it's our roots. It's the West's roots to the West,
and it's just beautiful. And it's there was this great debate over whether the Trojan War was real and whether it even happened back in the 19th century, 20th century. Many people thought the Trojan War never happened. It turns out it did. They found the actual ruins. The Trojan War happened around the 12th or 13th century, but BC. But even if it didn't, that wouldn't change anything about our appreciation of the poem. We can be quite certain that most of the things described in the Iliad or the Odyssey either didn't happen or were exaggerated or were aggregated from a number of other stories that happened before or after. And it doesn't change the impact of that story on us in the slightest. And it didn't have any impact on how unifying that story was for Greece and for Athens in particular. And it doesn't need to for us either.
Yeah, and I see what you're pointing at. And it's true for writers like Ursula K. Le Guin, Tolkien.
Yes.
Some of the... Yeah. When you read a story, you almost recreate it with the creator, in your mind, and you live out this world. And there are truths in stepping into those characters and understanding those emotions and those relationships and, the consequences some of their actions have. And so there's a lot to learn from stories, despite whether they are historically grounded in truth.
Yes. And maybe learn is even the wrong word. There's a lot to take from and become out of these stories alongside other people. Maybe you don't learn anything new at all on your 100th time through watching The Gladiator or reading Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer or whatever. But that repetition brings back the inspiration of the character. And yes, this is there's something I'm connecting with that I want to be more like by taking this in. And the beauty of the ancient Greek tragedies was that these were not just movies on a screen. They had a chorus that was a participant It was a body of participants from the community that would sing along and would participate in the drama of this tale. And it was an initiation into the stories that they told themselves about who they were. There's a wonderful book by Roy Rappaport called, what's the title? It's like Religion and Ritual and Language. I don't remember the title exactly, but the author is Roy Rappaport, and he advances a theory that language and religion co-evolved. And you can see some kind of hints with this in the animal world. You see like elephants performing their strange kind of funeral rituals. You see other, intelligent mammals and sometimes birds doing strange ritual-like behavior. His hypothesis is that, most animals can communicate with each other in a general, like, I'm going to make a scary sound to tell you to stay away. But there's a difference between communication and the more complex grammatical structure of language. And that's ritual in particular, and it co-evolved with the grammatical structure of language. In other words, stereotypic and repetitious, persistent patterns in action led to those same kinds of patterns in speech, and the resulting explosion in the complex possibilities of communication was preceded by or co-evolved with repetitions and idiosyncratic and stereotyped patterns in behavior. So what's implied there is that certain kinds of acts or repetitious acts were important to us before our ability to attach them to a particular story, which is a little mind-blowing to think about because it's completely backwards from how we have come to think about religion in a sort of fish swimming in the water of Christianity culture like ours.
Sure.
But I think at the end of the day, if you look at studies on addiction, and if you look at studies of depression, loneliness, most of what we suffer is a lack of connection with other people. And what we're striving for is connection with other people. The desire, the need for certainty, the need for truth, all of these kinds of intense needs for I need to believe in the right religion and so forth, come from a lack of connection, primarily. And if you have that connection, the need kind of evaporates a little bit. But these shared actions, these religions of custom, we might say, were the traditional means by which people were brought together in common attention, common focus, common action. I'm not trying to sound like a fascist here. It's like we all need to do the same thing at the same time. This can be just two people doing something together. That's their own little world. That's what marriage is, right? Two people doing their own little thing together. They're building their own world together.
No, but I agree. An engagement in a community ritual is deeply connecting, and we're seeing depression rates go up, loneliness go up as these institutions crumble.
Yeah.
We need to figure out a secular solution.
But and this is where the religious people will jump in and point to all the studies saying, well, evidence clearly shows that being religious is better for your psychological health and so forth. And they're, of course, correct. But what they always try to studiously avoid is that it's never religion specific, i.e. you don't get any special benefit by being a Christian over, say, a Muslim or a Hindu. It's just any participation in like any kind of church thing. It's connection with other people. It doesn't have anything to do with the belief at all. It's about connection with other people. And if you don't mind me proselytizing a little bit, this brings me back to the Odyssey. And there's a word there that is used to describe Odysseus which is his nous, or his mind, is how it's usually translated. But according to Greg Naj, mind is not actually
nous.
Yes, precisely. It's actually not a precisely correct translation. The way Naj translates, it can probably be interpreted in a few different ways depending on context. But the way that Naj translates it is as mental connection. And we see this in the opening.
I've never heard it that way.
We see this in the opening lines. Sorry, I'm still coming up from a cold. Where Homer says, that Odysseus came to see many cities of men and came to know their minds. That's the first time we hear the word nous, came to know their minds. It's coming to know them. And we see also in the Odyssey particular moments of physical transformation, which are always preceded by meaningful connection. The story is actually bookended by this. When Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is reminded of his father, he is visibly and physically transformed into more of a man, such that his mother and the suitors are like taken aback, like he's suddenly changed in a strange way. And at the very end, where Odysseus and Laertes, his father, are reunited, Laertes had been this very old, very sad old man, just dressed in rags, quietly tending his orchard by himself. The picture of old man depression, right? But after he's reunited with his son, they embrace, they greet, and then he goes and takes a bath. And when he emerges from the bath, he's described as being taller, stronger, radiant, and his son is like, you look like one of the immortal gods. Like this physical transformation that comes from these kinds of meaningful connections or reconnections is real, I think. And there's like empirical data on longevity that we can talk about, like the Stanford longitudinal study. To me, that's actually less interesting than just the personal experience of being there. I was talking to someone yesterday who was looking at pictures of soldiers in Ukraine. And he said there was one picture of these three guys standing together and they all looked sleep deprived and haggard and half starving. Someone had a pretty bad cut on their face and running around with military gear, had every reason in the world to be completely miserable. And they looked like they were having the time of their lives. Now, that's not advocating like war good or anything like that, but like the fact that they were sharing that suffering together creates a connection that changes the experience. And we don't have to wait for, the tragedy of war to experience that in our own lives. Right. We can do that together, and we don't need to ground the goodness of our lives we don't need to justify our life and to justify everything. This is something you'll hear from especially the Orthodox Christian debate crowd. How do you justify this? How do you justify that? It's like, who am I justifying this to?
Right. Isn't my being enough?
Yeah. No, I'm here to try to live a good life. And, and you don't have anything beyond language games to justify this anyways. But I know that connection and shared participation with other people in the stories that attract me and speak to me is one step I can make in that direction. And I'm happy to take on that challenge.
Well, yeah, thank you for proselytizing your pagan. No, I think it's important that people connect with their roots. I mean, there's multiple benefits here. Odyssey is a great piece of literature, like you said. I mean, almost every movie, book, show that we're consuming has taken elements from the Odyssey. It's evolved out of there. Hasn't been much original since Homer and Hesiod.
Yeah. And the Iliad too. I like to joke that Top Gun is basically the Iliad.
Yeah.
Even the death of Goose is just Patroclus.
But I don't know, if you're not rooted in anything, you're easily blown around. The next charlatan will come and pick you up. And so, I don't know, having some kind of foundation, understanding the evolution of thought and story can really bring a sense of stability to your life.
That's the story I've heard. And it on paper, logically, that makes a lot of sense. And you think, oh, I don't want to be completely untethered and just adrift in the ocean of different people's accounts in the sort of postmodern soup. But I think what many people have seen over the last, 5 or 6 years in particular, is that adding in the idea of truth does not tether you any harder, because the idea and the label of truth can be used to beat people around just as easily. Have you heard the phrase, follow the science used in a way
hold on, back me up though. Sure. To how the truth is coming in here?
Well, the truth is usually brought up as the tether point. My understanding of the origin of the Western concept of truth goes back to a need for an objective arbiter in resolving blood feuds. This goes back to, we see actually hints of this in the Iliad. The first trial by jury is depicted on the shield of Achilles in Book 18 of the Iliad.
No, I was saying, how are you tying that to having understood your history of thought, not having those stories grounded in any historical, I say historical and that's the wrong word, but right, we mentioned the Odyssey. If we examine those stories, we can say, well, yeah, those probably didn't happen, but we can still trace the literature and the line of thought.
Yeah. Well, when we're talking about not like grounding our sense of meaning and identity in literal truth, we're not dismissing the utility of truth in matters of, for example, construction, right? You don't want to dismiss mathematics there. We're not talking about avoiding the study of history to find more patterns or to connect with our past, in some reasons. But when it comes to grounding our identity and our sense of morality and right and wrong, I think that's a different category. And let me give how do I put this? If I were to tell you that all words are metaphors and all words are subjective, that there's a packing by the speaker and an unpacking by the receiver that is done by means of a whole bunch of associations, and no two people have exactly the same set of associations with a given word. And all of those meanings are unpacked at the same time. So if I say to you a word like democracy or romance or science, 12 different meanings, many of them mutually exclusive, unpack in your head emotionally at the same time. And that set is going to be different for different people. It's an inherently subjective media that can never be made objective, properly objective, for the purpose of finding objective truth through language. It just can't happen. Language can't do that.
Aristotle ran into that problem, found the circularity. And
there's a certain kind of person that will hear that and think, then we can't use language. Right. And it's like, no. We're using language perfectly meaningfully now. We're looking at it as engineers rather than as scientists or mathematicians. We're saying, what do I need to say that is close enough or that works for the purpose of conveying a certain meaning to the audience, to my fellow participant. And
very Popperian of you.
Perhaps so. And like you can understand the limitations and constraints of a thing without discarding it entirely. And I think historicity is one of those things that has constraints. We can never know with certainty what happened in the past. We have a hard enough time figuring out with certainty what's happening in the present, right? Have you tried to follow the news recently? What's true? Yeah.
Sure.
So that doesn't mean that trying to figure out what's true is not worth doing. It absolutely is. And it's a very valuable thing to do. But I wouldn't ground your sense of identity and spirituality on, the historicity of a particular story or individual.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree there. There I would take a Eastern approach actually and move beyond concepts to find my grounding.
Yes. The Tao Te Ching, no one said it better than the Tao as far as I can tell. That which can be spoken is not the true and eternal way or something. There's like a million translations of it, but
yeah. But yeah, no, and even the early Greeks, beginning with Protagoras, who famously says the individual is the measure of all things. And now it's like, wait, what? We all have our own truths and this.
Well, here it gets tricky, and there's a danger of a slide from, if you picture like objectivism up here, whether that's Ayn Randian or Christian or whatever, down to subjectivism, where it's like, okay, we have our own perspectives and we don't have actual access to what Kant would call the noumena, right? We don't have access to the thing in itself, the truth. It's imagined that therefore we have to slide into relativism. Right. That man is the measure of all things. My truth is just as good as your truth. And I mean,
which let me say, I don't think Protagoras actually was a moral relativist.
No, I don't think so. It's something that's brought up, and I think,
but it is a slippery slope, and often people do fall into it.
Well, and it's something that moral absolutists and objectivists think that if it's not objective, then everything is equal. And it's like, is that your subjective experience? If you're looking at, just an example, two fighters, right? And one of them is well built and has been training for 5 years. And the other one is a loudmouthed YouTuber who wanted to get some views, right? If you had to put money on the fight, both bets are not equal. Those bets are not equally likely. It's not equally likely that the YouTuber beats the trained fighter. Now, you don't know. Right. You don't know the outcome with certainty. But anyone who says because you don't know with certainty, therefore all bets are equal is silly. That's not anybody's subjective experience of the world unless they're delusional, unless they don't have any experience. So subjectivity itself, experience in the world, is actually perfectly sufficient to defeat the supposed slippery slope from subjectivism into relativism. I just wanted to put that out because the line from Protagoras, and I believe it's put into the mouth of another sophist in one of Plato's dialogues, and I don't remember which one off. Gorgias, I believe.
Yeah, Gorgias.
It's put into the mouth of an actual relativist, even though I'm sure you're correct, and Protagoras probably wasn't a relativist. And so I wanted to take a moment to flag that and say.
No, yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, interesting. So let me take a step back for a minute, because what I run into a lot with people that have lost a faith is this Nietzschean problem of meaningless. Like, okay, we've killed God, now what?
Right.
Like, what does it matter? And yeah, they fall into a depression and the vitality is lost. And yeah.
Yeah. And it's hard because it's one of those things where, like, on paper, you can just say, well, they were wrong. There isn't a hell. So you've got nothing to worry about. But people's brains don't, of course, work philosophically in that way. There's this sort of emotional and associative half-life of all these thoughts and ideas, and people can have feelings of shame and guilt or feelings of sinfulness that extend years, if not decades, past a loss of faith. And it's hard, but I think the way out is kind of the way in, which is to say repetition. It's ritual that replaces the old ritual. And I think the worst thing that people can do is to kind of sit alone in their own disillusionment and just kind of spiral in and dwell on the absence of the old ritual. That sort of deepens the negative feelings. I don't think that's good at all. I think you need to, as best you can, find community and a new shared activity, because I do believe that action precedes the feeling of meaning and belonging and importance. And it's like, it is entirely useless to just tell someone this when they're feeling disillusioned and nihilistic and everything. But on the other side of that participation, as someone who was once a fairly strong believer, I don't have any negative feelings about it. You can move past that.
Yeah, and that's what I often tell people too. It is a stepping stone, but I think your advice was wise there, to not sit and dwell in it and just condition that tendency of mind, but establish a routine, a community, get involved. And, we've all seen it in ourselves or in our kids where, down and they don't want to do anything. They don't have any energy. And we're like, you need to get up and do something.
Get outside.
And get outside. And then let's see what happens, what you're feeling. So, yeah, I think that action does precede the kind of emotional response there. So, yeah, wise advice.
And meaning as well, which is the wild one, because, in Christianity, word precedes existence. God creates by the word, and Jesus is the Logos, and in fact, Aletheia as well. He's truth itself, and he is the Word made flesh. In reality, it's the real world is the other way around. It's reality happens, and then we interpret and describe with words. But it's not about the words. It's like Bruce Lee. This is right. The finger. The moon is the real world. Yeah. And there's a funny parable, Platonic comparison we could make there with the cave, and what's the sun and what's the cave, and our ideas really different than images and so forth. But maybe for another time.
Yeah. There's been just undertones of Plato the whole time that I've wanted to play around with, but I think we'll save that maybe for another podcast. But you've been great. Is there any final advice you would give to my listeners?
Oh man. Well, I guess the general thing would be do things. I can't express how grateful I've been that I made the leap from academia into the trades, and that every day I wake up and I'm doing things with my hands and making lights turn on and making people's power work. It's not glorious work exactly, but it's intensely rewarding. I work with some cool people, and I think a lot of people would benefit more from doing physical work with their hands more, for whatever that's worth.
I mean, our hands, these were evolutionarily hard earned.
Very posable thumbs. Big deal.
Yeah. Hey, well, Chris, thank you. I really appreciate your time and look forward to speaking to you in the future.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
You too.